Good day, everybody. I'm Travis Newton. I'll be discussing remote sensing and social sciences. It's one of the topics that we don't usually talk or think about when we talking about remote sensing. During my undergrad work, I got heavy into the social sciences and the difference between the rich poverty and the environmental social injustice that goes on with the two different things. So, looking at these neighborhoods, how can we transfer the left side where we have the proletariats on the outside of the city serving the bourgeois of society to our right side where we have encompassed all poor and rich into one homogeneous state. Yes. So the UN has gone ahead and given us a global definition of their term of slums dwellings. It's an informal settlement deprived of access to safe water, acceptable sanitation, durable housing, overcrowded, and lack of land tenure security, which means they don't have the right to land. So why should I invest building something nice on it or doing any land improvements? Previously, we used to call these traditional villages, and each one of these different characteristics that you see on the top right come with a different meaning to them. So like squatter might have to deal with land rights, or shantytown just equals poor. And so what kind of a percentage of government is sponsored these report writings? Is it 50%? Is it 100%? I don't know. It's just a question I threw out there. This article that I read just happens to be by a university in the Netherlands, who I'm sure has a government grant. Right, here's some different examples. Over on the right, we have urban planning subject to mudslides, haphazardly being thrown up there. We have USAID projects going on, where they're putting little wells to these shanty towns in Africa. Africa has the highest growing rate of slums annually, 7 million people, or 7 million dwellings. Asia and Latin America are also up there, and countries all have different categories to define those slums, which makes it difficult for a globalization plan. And so we have an actual mixture of VHR and HR resolution data that is needed or is being used for mapping of these social problems. Beginning in the 2000s, they started becoming available to the public. A lot of this stuff is going to be for purchase, though, which then reduces the amount of studies that are being done. 4 major methods of the monitoring. We're looking at visual interpretation, object-based image analysis, texture-based, and community-based. So we get census data to help confirm what we're seeing from the satellites. On the top right, we have the machine learning algorithm picture. It's gone out there and it's identifying the geometry of these buildings and then returning that. But then we also run into problems depending on what the computer is being programmed for as far as slums. Is it a coastal area? Is it a desert? Is it a jungle, peri-urban? And you'll see I talk about jungle in just another slide here. And real briefly, we're dealing with the Copernicus program is providing most of the satellite data for these social science studies. And looking at those MDGs and SDGs, and if anybody's familiar with those are the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Really attacks like health, poverty, women's issues, children problems, mortality rates, and stuff like that. You see those 4 other domains: their economy, environment, governance, and social. All right, we need a under 5 meter resolution for correct geometry of the mapping for these urban areas. And so we got a nice picture with all the different satellites here. Akona's QuickBird spot usage are the heavy ones, but then you also have the GeoEye and the worldview. But all these come with a heavy price. In Asia, you need under 2 meters because you're starting to deal with all that jungle and you have vegetation patches. And so if they're incorporated heavily into the vegetation, won't be able to discern the difference between the urban areas and the jungle itself. And then the entropy of the roads, or the thermal imaging that are coming back from the roads. Is it dirt? What's the size of it? Is it made of concrete? And then, of course, the more open the terrain is, like deserty and without vegetation, it's going to give a better return in places like Kabul, Kandahar, La Paz. We know these are already slum dwelling areas in the first place with census data and boots on the ground. So the satellites is just kind of confirming that. As we move forward in justification of aid funding with the NGOs for these different programs for slum dwellings to show that they do exist, and what are the spatial correlations of the impacts of my city from those poor citizens living in these unkept areas. And then also we're going to have to be able to discern between slums of hope and slums of despair, are two different coined terms being used here. And is it a mining operation that's just popped up and will be there for 6 months to a year, or is this the outskirts of a poverty-stricken area? And lastly, we talked about remote sensing and climate change. And where does this all lead? Okay, well, poverty leads to slums. Slums lead to linear urban sprawl, which is creates social and environmental issues. Once you have that, people are going to start harvesting those natural resources. Lumber for cooking, lumber for houses. Degradation of lands. Once you have no natural resources left, then war takes place over them and destroys the rest of it. And then we all know, no green, no life. And then we have our politicians over here on the right. And lastly, here is some reference data. The top one is the article I read for this, and then the second article is one I found after the fact. It deals on the same thing, but more into the actual remote sensing data points versus the social science data. Have a good one.